Tonight, we bring you 9 accounts from people who went camping in the fall and left changed. The leaves were gold, the days were shorter, and the fog came down like a curtain. Small things that made everything feel older and thinner than it should. Trigger note: some stories mention missing persons, break-ins, and violence without graphic detail. If you like investigations that feel immediate and stories that linger, stay until the end. There's one account that still makes even seasoned rangers uneasy. If something here unsettles you, several resources are linked in the description. Please check them for support and safety information. Before the first story, take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the rest of these files. We bring a new set of accounts like these every month, and the last one is the one people still argue about. 1. I've camped every autumn for 10 years. I knew the ridge like the back of my hand, the permit numbers, the creek crossings, where the trail turned to scree and the pines gave way to aspens. I drove up alone that October because I needed the quiet. I set up just off the main loop, a flat patch under a ring of pines where the needles fell like ash. I put my pack against a tree, hung my lantern on a low branch, and made a small fire. The night smelled like smoke and wet leaves. The air was thin enough to make the stars sharp. At about 2 in the morning, I woke because the tent flap was rubbing against my cheek. It was a soft, repeated scrape, like someone walking a zip line with fingers. I froze. My first thought was raccoon. Then I remembered the pocket knife was in the gear bag, the bear spray in its holster, my phone dead because I'd left it in the truck to save battery. The scrape stopped. I lay there listening to my breath. I poke at my zipper. I whisper, "Hello?" Nothing. The scrape begins again, closer, circling. It sounded like someone tracing the seams of the fabric, every sweep deliberate, patient. I crawled out into cold air, boots crunching, and the lantern swung low. The trees were black against a low fog, and the circle of my campsite looked wrong. There were prints. Not animal prints. Deep, parallel impressions like boots had walked in a slow circle around the tent, the soles scuffing the duff as if they'd been pressed hard each time. The circle narrowed where the footprints doubled back, as though someone had taken tiny, careful steps to make sure no one inside could see. I thought of a prank at first, so I did the stupid thing. I called out, "Hey, who's there?" My voice sounded too loud in the ring of trees. The fog swallowed the answer. Then I noticed the bark on the tree where my pack leaned. A strip of pale wood had been scraped away, 5 inches long, fresh, and someone had carved something into the bark. The slash of a knife, faint letters, but the fog and the low light made it unreadable. I packed with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. My hands missed knots, dropped a tent stake. I left so fast I didn't notice the footprints weren't human at all when I looked back in daylight. In the morning, when the ranger came to check the leave no trace box, he crouched by the tree and said nothing for a long time while he photographed the bark with his phone. He told me they'd found similar marks on other trees a few miles away, and that people reported circling noises near dispersed sites. Authorities logged my report as a potential trespass, no arrests. The photograph I took of the bark, I keep it folded in a pocket of my pack, in a small zip-top bag. Sometimes at night I take it out and press my thumb on the pale groove and tell myself it was someone with a knife, someone human. But the grooves are too neat to be knife marks, and when I blow on that little strip of wood dust, comes away like ash. 2. Content warning. This account includes mention of a confrontation with suspected criminal activity and a later police investigation. I thought the RV lot behind the old ranger station was a joke when my buddy Dan suggested we park there for the weekend. He wanted convenience, hook up to his small generator, a place to plug in a small heater. We were on the edge of the national forest, where dispersed camping met the abandoned logging roads. There were a few other rigs, older rigs, and a guy with a dog who kept to himself. We sat outside under a canopy of bronze leaves and drank coffee that tasted like metal. On the second night, someone tampered with the van's tires. I woke at 3 to a hiss and found one tire deflated, slow and deliberate.
The dog across the lot was quiet. Dan swore quietly and walked the perimeter. He found disturbed earth at the edge of the trees, like someone had dug shallow depressions and refilled them, fingerprints in the dust where someone had kneeled. There were also small, neat notches on the bumper, thin slashes through paint into metal, like someone had left a message but then stopped. We called the ranger. They told us to stay put. A patrol showed up with 2 deputies who were all business. They took notes, photographed the slashed bumper and the shallow holes, told us not to touch anything. The deputies said this matched a pattern, sabotage to immobilize vehicles where organized groups could move around unseen, but they hedged it with, "We can't say more." They interviewed our neighbor, a man who'd been staying there for weeks, and he denied any knowledge. The deputies pulled the man's ID, took fingerprints, and then told us to be cautious. The next evening, a pair of headlights came down the logging
road and stopped just outside the ring of lights. 2 men stepped out, one wearing a cap that had the faded emblem of a forestry crew. But their boots were wrong, clean, too new to have been on those roads. They walked slowly, scanning the rigs like they owned the place. One of them stopped in front of our van, took a long picture with an old film camera. No flash, just a frame, and left. We didn't wake the deputies because we were afraid of what that would invite. Instead, we packed at first light and left with the slashed tire patched enough to get home. Weeks later, a detective emailed that the man who'd been staying near us had been arrested in a nearby county on charges related to vehicle tampering linked to a ring that targeted remote campers. The detective attached a cropped, grainy photograph from the film camera found in a motel room. A pair of boots by a van, the van's bumper with the same notches. The photograph was evidence. The man who'd taken it said nothing. Charges were pending. We never went back to that stretch of road. Dan sold the generator. I still wake when tires hiss. The sound is sharp and clinical in my ears now. 3. The Mirror Grove is small and almost impossible to find unless you already know the trail that falls away into a ravine and then opens into a stand of aspen trees where the trunks cluster like white columns. We were part of a group of 6 from college, carrying 2 cameras and a drone to get aerial shots of the turning leaves. It was the kind of night you felt blessed to be alive. Clear, cold, a harvest moon feathered with cloud. We set up our tents in a clearing by a pond that held the sky like a coin. We took pictures as the sun sank, laughing at our faces reflecting in the pond. I remember the click of shutters, the smell of gas from the drone, the orange glow from headlamps. Around midnight, Jessa, she was always the brave one, decided to photograph the grove alone. She walked the rim and framed the trunks until the moon went behind cloud. An hour later, she came running back, breathless, face white. "You have to see this picture," she said. She showed us the image on her camera. It was the grove, like we'd photographed 1,000 times. But in the middle, between 2 trunks, someone else stood. Not a person we knew. A silhouette, like a cutout, slender, hands at sides. We all swore it was one of the group playing a joke. Then Jessa scrolled. The next photo, taken a minute later, showed the silhouette closer. The last photo had the figure right behind the line of trees, where nothing had been when she framed the first shot. The timestamps were 12 minutes apart. Jessa swore she had not moved from the rim. None of us saw anyone. We went back at dawn. The pond held only mist and our breath. On one aspen, the bark had been stripped in a perfect oval, smooth as bone. There were no footprints from the pond to the grove in the frost. The drone log showed it flew the perimeter, but the footage from the grove itself had a blank gap. The device recorded a 10-second clip of pure static at the exact minute on Jess's camera where the silhouette appears, and then resumed. We turned the static into a waveform, and the technician at a shop said it looked like interference, but not the kind a drone would make. It bore a pattern he could not match to a device. We left photographs with a friend who studies old logging maps. He later pointed out the grove sat on the edge of an abandoned logging cut that had been cleared a century ago. Locals told stories, half remembered, of a man who disappeared in the grove during a logging accident, and of campers who found their cameras showing frames they hadn't taken. The group split after that season. Jessa still posts landscape photos online, beautiful and distant, but she refuses to go back to that stand of aspens. The photos I keep are printed and tucked into an envelope in my sock drawer. Sometimes, in bed, I fold them and try to see the figure without blinking. It's easier to sleep when I keep my feet under the covers. IV. Content warning. This account references a missing young person. The description is non-graphic and focuses on procedural response and survivor feelings. I promised myself we'd be careful. My sister and her friend were teens then. She was 17, riding with us to a family campsite at the edge of a reservoir. They wanted to explore on their own for a while, ankle deep in that famous fall bravery teenagers have. Flashlights, a thermos of cocoa, no parents watching. We gave them boundaries and a return time. The woods beyond the picnic loop were a bramble of brush and golden leaves. The trail they chose ran along a ridge with a view I used to photograph when I was 12. When they didn't come back, we waited an hour, then 2. By dusk, my stomach did a cold roll. The ranger took our report and organized a search with volunteers and a rescue dog. The search grid moved through fog and into a slope of bracken, and the dog worked its nose along a stream until the handlers called him back. They found a line of footprints leading away from the picnic area, then stopping abruptly at a place where the ground became churned and pale. The only physical evidence was a small glove caught on a branch and a scrap of foil, part of the thermos lid. Investigators checked phone pings. There was nothing accurate. The density of trees meant the signal bounced. Cameras at the trailhead recorded the girls leaving and not returning. Interviews followed that felt
Like going through the same glass wall, questions about relationships, about whether they'd been meeting someone, about drugs. I answered with a knot in my throat. Days stretched into a week. Authorities widened the search, brought in regional search and rescue, and posted missing person notices. Volunteers combed the creek beds and old foundations. One volunteer found stretched bark with deep marks, like someone had scaled the tree and used the trunk to haul themselves up, but no clear sign beyond that. After 3 weeks, the leads thinned and the case file went cold. The detective told us they had circumstantial evidence of someone running a small group that led young people off trails to target them for robbery in the county, a cautionary pattern, but nothing tied it specifically to our location. My sister still calls me at odd hours. She stopped going out with friends after dark. She sleeps with the lights on. She avoids trails that slope down to water. The glove is folded and kept in a drawer. Sometimes I open the drawer and just hold it, because doing so feels like a small, private protest against the way the world shrank that October. V. I worked as a seasonal ranger for 2 summers and 1 fall. My beat included the northern access for a wilderness area where the trees go thin and the wind has a way of filling your ears with static. Rangers are serious about permits and leave no trace, but we also hear stories. You pick up patterns: campers who call about their gear, hikers who come back 2 hours later smelling like someone else's smoke. One night I responded to a call about a vehicle abandoned on a pullout. The headlights had been left on, running down the battery, and there were 3 tents pitched in the clearing. The occupants said they'd gone to sleep and woke to the feeling of being watched. The first evidence that troubled me was the ring of stones laid around the tents. Not a normal campfire ring, but small, smooth stones placed equidistant like beads on a string. Then we found slashes on the tents, small cuts, neat and shallow, as if someone had tested the nylon to see how quickly it would tear. The strongest evidence, though, was a set of parallel handprints on the van's window. 2 streaks where someone had put palms and dragged them down to smear something dark and dried. We called for backup and a canine. The dog did not find a human scent trail leaving the site. The scent ended abruptly at the tree line. I processed the scene with the deputy, noted the stones, the tent cuts, the prints, and the way the earth looked as if dozens of small, rhythmically spaced steps had pressed into it. When investigators came in the morning, they cataloged the stones and ran tests on the smudges on glass. It turned out to be a combination of sap and charcoal. The report said possibly staged, possibly prank, but the pattern.
So, salmon does have iron in it, but it's not a lot. There's better sources of iron. I took a photo of the stone ring and later used it in a briefing with a regional coordinator who told me to document everything and to advise campers to sleep with vehicles locked, lights on, and to place their gear inside. The campers I helped that night left at dawn. One later emailed to say they'd sold the van at a loss. I still carry the habit of checking for aligned stones at sites I pass. Sometimes, when I find them, I disassemble the ring and scatter the stones into the brush. It gives me a false sense of control. V. We were 3 friends who decided to hike the long loop around Mirror Lake because the weather forecast promised crisp nights, and the lake was a perfect shield for moonlight. We arrived late, threw down the tarp, and told ghost stories until the cold made our voices thin. I was the least experienced, the only one who didn't own a proper sleeping bag. They rented me a small liner and told me I'd be fine. Around midnight we heard singing. It was far away at first, a single thin voice finding something in the trees. Then the sound drew nearer, not following a trail, but coming in waves that matched the fog. It wasn't a word I recognized, an old chant maybe, or a prayer lost to time. The singing threaded between the trees, and at one point our fire guttered, though there was no wind. The singer stopped, and a small orange light bobbed at the tree line, steady and then gone. We joked about hikers with lanterns until the orange light appeared again, closer, then circling the campsite like a slow, worn headlamp. The light wasn't a headlamp at all. When Marcus grabbed his headlamp and swept the tree line, he found dozens of tiny orange glints reflected back. Tiny beads of light caught in the bark, as if someone had inset chips of amber into the trunks. The bark around each bead was darkened, scorched in a ring. There were handprints on the trunks, but they were small and tapered, more like palms of children, though we'd all left an empty site map and no children were around. We packed immediately and hiked out. On the trail we found a circle of leaves laid neat and flat, like a tabletop, with a small pile of ash at its center. We reported what we could. The investigators took soil samples from the ash and found traces of resin consistent with pine pitch and something else, an adhesive compound used in small craft, not common in the wild. They chalked it up to a local artist, perhaps, but the pattern matched another call the week before, 2 valleys over. Tiny orange lights, singing, and burned circles on bark. The afterword is the worst part. I stopped going out to places where the trees gather in circles. I dream in the dry rasp of singing and wake with the taste of smoke in my mouth. V. Before it happened, I trusted uniforms. So when a man in what looked like a ranger's jacket approached our group and offered to lead us to a shortcut, I handed him my map without thinking. He said his name was Jonah and that he'd been doing volunteer patrols on weekends. He knew the back trails better than any of us. It was late September and the sky was thick with rain, so we thought a shortcut sounded smart. We followed him for a while, and he moved like someone who belonged on those trails, confident with an easy step. Then the trail became less maintained. Blazes were painted over with moss, and my phone's GPS spun for a moment, as if deciding where it was. Jonah's voice changed when the pines closed in. He started telling stories about the old logger who would come to the campfires and trade songs for pennies. He hummed while he walked. The path he led us down was an old skid road that lost elevation into a bowl of trees where the light did a strange green wash. When I turned to ask him the time, he was gone. We called out. The rain ate our words. We found his jacket on a stump, folded perfectly, the pockets empty. Nearby, the bark of a young fir had been shaved in thin strips to show raw, pale wood, and somebody had left a small pile of coins around the base, pennies polished and arranged like a child's offering. We ran back the way we'd come and found the main trail as if nothing had happened, but the skids leading to the bowl were smoothed, almost like a path used yesterday. We reported the jacket and the coins. The sheriff came and took the jacket and checked the seams for traces of DNA, but found nothing.
They said sometimes people drop jackets or leave them as offerings, but the deputy's eyes were flat when he told us that. Months later, a hiker reported being led off trail by a man claiming to be a volunteer, the man's jacket matching the photograph we'd given. The man has never been found. After that, I kept my map against my chest when I hiked. I stopped trusting people who volunteer to help. 8. I'll admit, I wanted the story to be something I could explain. Maybe it was sleep deprivation, maybe it was alcohol, but there's a mark on my tent I still think about. We were on a 3-night trip with a small group of coworkers who wanted one last blast of autumn before winter. We drank, cooked, and argued like adults trying to pretend they weren't tired. On the last night, I was the first to wake. At the edge of sleep, I heard a scratch, sharp like nails on fabric. The sleeping bag shifted under my weight.
As I sat up, someone had tied a thin lace across our tent's zipper from the outside, a small loop that snagged and held unless you yanked hard. I unzipped slowly. The noise stopped. My coworker Sarah's face was pale in the dim light. She'd been breathing loudly, asleep. I stood outside the tent because the air was too tight for me there. The trees felt like they leaned over the clearing. Then I saw marks on the tent, little crescent cuts near the seam, as if something had tried to make a small keyhole. The hair at the back of my neck rose. We left at dawn. When we walked past the place where our vehicle had been parked, we saw the hood smeared with something dark and sticky, and in that smear, someone had left an imprint, like the outline of a palm, long and deliberate. At the sheriff's office, they took photographs, logged my statement, and told me it was likely youth messing around. But the deputy's tone changed when he saw the smear photo. "We found similar imprints on a rape kit in another county," he said carefully, and then apologized because he shouldn't have said that. My friends and I kept arguing about whether to press charges. In the end, the evidence was circumstantial. We left the report open. I no longer sleep with my window open, even in summer. The tent's little crescent cuts are still there in my gear bin. They make me breathe as if the air is thin, and I can't shake the feeling that someone tested the fabric to see how much sound it would let through. 9. The last file is small and old, and maybe the reason some rangers never camp alone in October. I used to be a skeptic about time slips and ghosts. I didn't believe people when they told me their cameras recorded things that weren't there. Then I spent a night near an abandoned logging camp where the map simply said, "Old camp, not maintained." We came with rope and chainsaws because we planned to clear a fallen branch blocking the trail. It was colder than expected, and the wood smoke from our small fire smelled like memory, as if it belonged to a time before us. Around midnight, my watch slipped by an hour. I checked the GPS. It showed my coordinates, but the timestamp on the saved waypoint backfilled an extra hour with no signal loss. One of the guys, Alex, who kept a field notebook, wrote down the time as 12:07. He later found an entry in the notebook in ink that wasn't his. A short line scrawled sharp, "We left them in circles." He swore it hadn't been there when he checked, but the ink looked fresh. I took a picture of the camp at dawn, and when I flipped through the phone, the pictures from the night were wrong. One photo showed us around the fire, blankets on our knees, but between us and the flames was a row of figures, like columned shadows, all facing us and not moving. In another frame, the landscape was identical, but the leaves behind us were in a different season, summer green instead of fall gold. The camera's metadata recorded the same minute for both images. The files were stamped with the correct time for our watch, but the content of the frame seemed to come from 2 different years. We handed the memory card to a tech who said it looked corrupted. He tried to recover the files and sent us a zipped folder labeled Artifacts. He also sent a note that some of the recovered frames had repeated pixels in a pattern that didn't match any sensor issue he knew. The most chilling thing was a photograph we'd taken together, smiling, but in the reflection of the lake, a single person stood behind us who wasn't in the group. Alex deleted that image from his camera and refuses to talk about it publicly. He now keeps his camera in a drawer. I keep my copies in a cloud folder I rarely open.
Occasionally, I stare at the lake photo until the extra figure blurs, and for a beat, I feel sure I remember seeing someone there that night. Someone who walked in a circle along the water and left no footprints. Closing. Those are the 9 accounts: the circling footprints, the slashed bumper, the Mirror Grove photograph, the missing teen, the ranger's stone ring, the singing with orange lights, the man in a uniform who vanished, the tent scratches and palm smears, and the photographs that don't follow time. They are bound by a few recurring things: fog that eats sound, trees that hold their own unknown histories, and patterns laid down in circles. Some end with police notes and open files, others end with the survivors' endings: no longer camping, a stack of photographs kept under a sock drawer, a tent with small crescent cuts. Each of these people went into the woods expecting a retreat, and came back with a piece of something that changed the way they think about quiet and shadow. If you were unsettled by any of these stories, please check the description for support resources and links to safety guidance for outdoor activities. If you have a story you think fits these files, something you experienced while camping in the fall, we want to hear it. Share it in the comments or reach out through the contact link. Anonymized tips help keep the chain of reports intact and help researchers and rangers connect patterns. If this hour left you cold, please like and subscribe, and hit the bell so you get notified when we release more files like these. And most of all, stay safe out there. Leave a trip plan with someone you trust, mark your return time, and trust your instincts when something in the forest feels off. In the weeks after the upload, the inbox filled in a way that made
Me feel both useful and foolish. People sent messages with maps and shaky video, with burned CDs and screenshots, with careful timestamps and the occasional pleading, "Are you listening?" Some messages were short, a location and a single line, "We saw the circle." Others came from lawyers and journalists, and one ranger captain who asked me bluntly to stop stirring things he said were better left buried. I kept answering, because silence felt worse than the noise. The tech who recovered the images, Darren, agreed to speak after I promised not to record him. He met me at a diner off the highway and kept his hands on his coffee the whole time, fingers moving slow like someone trying to steady a compass. He told me the stitches he'd made in the corrupted files weren't random error. When he ran the frames through different filters, the repeated pixels formed curves, not noise. Ellipses that, when fed into a plotting routine, traced rough circles. Not every frame, he said, but enough that it looks deliberate, like somebody or something is imposing geometry over moments. He also found audio buried under the hiss in several files, a low-band harmonic that sat under the human frequencies, audible only when you pushed the equalizer to extremes. When translated into spectrogram, it produced shapes, waving rings, concentric, that echoed the pixel patterns. He laughed once, a tight sound, and said, "It's like the files are singing in circles." Alex spoke to me later, quieter than I expected. He would not let me copy his notebook or the picture he refused to show the public, but he told me where it lived, a drawer at home, beneath a stack of class notes and a broken headlamp. He let me stay for half an hour on his front porch while he opened and closed other drawers as if searching for courage. He said the ink that wasn't his had been pressure-heavy, like someone had been writing hard through a page beneath it. He had dreamed of circles since that night, he told me, and in the dreams he always woke with wet leaves on his cheek. "I don't camp anymore," he said, "but the other night I woke at 3 and heard something walking the yard. It sounded like someone dragging a rake around. I checked, nothing. But in the morning, the grass by the mailbox was folded down in a ring. My wife thinks I'm losing it. I don't know what I think." When we went back to the old camp, it was under a light rain that smeared the maples into watercolor. You could still see the old logging road if you knew where to look, a shallow cut that time and hand had softened to a dip. The fire pit was there. Someone had stacked wood in a neat spiral inside it. I didn't know if it had always been that way. The circle of stones Darren mentioned, Ranger's stone ring, Alex's tent scratches, the footprint pattern in file 2, seemed to cast an expectation over the place. Where there was one circle, there might be others. Maya came with me. She is small and blunt and carries a camera like she keeps a baton. We walked the perimeter and found marks. Pressed soil in a ring just outside the campsite, leaves that had been trampled inward in an almost perfect band. The impression was too regular to be deer or booted hikers. The circumference measured 7 paces, give or take. When we stepped inside it, the air felt heavier, as if someone had closed the space with invisible hands. I kept thinking about the phrase that had been scrawled in Alex's notebook, "We left them in circles," where "them" meant who? The missing teen? The uniformed man who vanished? The extra person in the lake reflection? Or something older than any of the accounts, something that uses circles the way a sculptor uses compasses. At the ranger station, someone slid an old survey chart across to me. It was brittle and folded wrong, ink faded to the color of tea. The chart dated from the logging company's early days and included a notation: campsites clustered, ring roads probable. There were other marks, hand-drawn, that didn't correspond to the company's work. A dotted line that made a wide loop through several camp names, like a string pulled tight over pegs. The penmanship matched the kind that wrote in the margins of county records in the 1930s. No explanation, no signature. Back in my apartment, the cloud folder I had put the files in, a safe place, I thought, had expanded overnight. New files had appeared. A shaky video of a lake at dawn that was not the lake we shot. A photo of a winter camp from last year, except the metadata dated it 3 years ago. I told myself the cloud was corrupt, that servers misbehave and thumbnails get stuck. Darren rolled his eyes and said, "They don't appear like that without someone putting them there." Then I received an unmarked envelope in the post. Inside was a single Polaroid, the kind that edges white and soft and smells faintly of developer. It showed my own porch with the light off. The front step was empty, except a ring had been pressed into the gravel, leaves arranged around it like a wreath. Someone had written on the back in heavy, black ink, "Don't forget to plan." My hands shook. I posted the picture to myself as a stupid performative act. I had a copy, in the inbox, in the cloud, on an external drive. The email headers showed it came from a throwaway account, registered the week before. No IP trace, no return useful. I started sleeping less. When I did sleep, the dream was always the same. Me, standing at the center of a ring of stones, and beyond, Stones, the trees, bending backward like an audience. In the dream, circular motion felt inevitable and kind, like breathing. When I woke, the kitchen light would be on, and the coffee machine would have been started. I would find a pot half brewed, as if someone had anticipated my waking. Never a footprint, never a smear. 3 different people sent me audio clips of singing. They were all low, a chant under other sounds. In one, the voices overlapped like a chorus standing on different floors of a building. In another, a single voice carried a melody that rose and fell like the motion of a child drawing a circle with a fogged window. All of them contained the same phenomenon Darren had found in the files, a subharmonic layer that, when visualized, created ringed shapes in the spectrogram. I started to collect these like a hobbyist collects shells, pressing them into a box and labeling them by location. Crossing 17, mile marker 10, old camp. The pattern that hurt my head the most was the map I laid out on my kitchen floor. The coordinates from each case, the boot prints, the bumper, the grove, the lake photo, the tent. I pinned them and then ran string between them. The string made a loop I hadn't expected. It wasn't just a ring of sites spread randomly across the county. When I traced the line, the loop tightened and became almost perfect. At its center, in a stand of private timberland that the maps call not maintained, sat a tiny square labeled clearing. It was a place I had walked past and never seen, because who goes looking for a clearing labeled like that? Who would notice a little square on a government map and think it's significant? I asked the county records office for recent permits. They sent me a printout full of redactions and a polite but firm refusal. They could not share active access requests. The redactions themselves created a ring of black on the page, a negative circle. In the gaps of the letters, I started to see shapes. The same ellipse shape Darren had recovered from corrupted frames. I thought about calling the police. Then I thought about what they would say and how to explain a ring of leaves around a mailbox or a Polaroid that might be a postal prank. Who investigates when the evidence is photographs that are wrong and pixels that hum? It seemed that any formal route would categorize these accounts as misperception and move on. So I kept following the tangles myself. There is a woman in the next town, an archivist named Ruth, who works with oral histories. She agreed to meet me in a small reading room full of dust. She pulled an oral interview from a cassette box, a rural voice from 50 years ago, telling a story about men who disappeared from logging camps and the way the rings formed.
In the mud. She folded her palms over the cassette as if it were warm. People don't tell these things, she said, and when they do, it's only to close their own mouth. They pass it and they forget the why. But the patterns, she tapped the table, patterns live longer than memory. Ruth reached for something else in a stack and found a page of field notes, brittle, penciled in with short ticks. Among the notes was a phrase written in a style that looked like a different hand from the rest. Circles for leaving, circle for finding. Not quite a sentence, a map key, perhaps. She frowned and then shook her head as if the page annoyed her. They used to put people in circles for reasons, she said, not always the same reason. Sometimes to mark, sometimes to hide, sometimes to remember. If there was a through line to all of it, it was this: circles that repeat, like fingerprints. Sometimes they were made by the living. Sometimes they belonged to the old work of land, stumps left standing in particular rings around a stump, or the layout of a camp road that looped back on itself. The human-made and the accidental overlapped until it became impossible to tell which was which. Then the 10th file arrived. It was not sent to me. I found it by accident when I went to check a folder I thought I had sealed. The file was labeled in a font that looked like someone had written with a stub of a pen. F10.txt and a companion .wav. There was no header. The .txt contained a single sentence. We found a center. The WAV played 3 seconds of silence, and then, under it, a thin noise like someone drawing a stick in wet clay. The spectrogram, because my fingers moved before my mind did and I fed the file to Darren, showed the same concentric rings I had been tracing on maps and paper. But there was something else. Over the rings was a small spike, a dot centered in the middle. The dot corresponded to coordinates embedded in the file's properties. The coordinates pointed to a place I knew, though I had never been there in the way the file suggested. It was the clearing at the center of the loop I'd pinned on the kitchen floor. I drove there at dawn. The rain had stopped and the air felt thin with cold. The clearing sat in a dip and held a stillness that was almost sleep. At its center lay a rusted bit of metal, half buried and pitted. It looked like the lid of an old latrine, or a manhole cover, but smaller. The earth around it had been pressed into a ring, like the footpath of a circle walked for years. I leaned down. The cover moved under my hands, a small sound like a sigh. At the rim, wet and dark as if someone had
traced it with a finger, were small crescent marks, like the tent cuts from the files. I did not lift the cover. I do not think now that I should have. But there was a small hole in the side where the metal had corroded, and through it came a smell like old rain and the metallic tang of a well that had not been used in decades. In the dim, the hole looked like an eye. As I stood, boots in the damp, I heard it, very soft, a circle of steps the other side of the clearing, like someone walking along the outer edge. I turned. Empty trees. The sound circled once and stopped, as though whoever, or whatever, had been circling had decided to leave the pattern incomplete. I took pictures. My hands shook for reasons that weren't only the cold. Later, at home, I looked at the images and found one I didn't remember taking. It was of my own back as I photographed the rusted cover, and in the reflection of a puddle, a figure stood behind me, Not more than an outline, but turned toward the camera in a way that made the skin along the neck of my shirt prickle. I started to get calls at night. Sometimes nothing would be said. Other times, a voice would whisper a single phrase and hang up. Once, a woman's voice sang a line of the melody that had been cropping up in files. A simple rise and fall, the syllables unfastened, like someone reciting the same child's rhyme in a different tongue. "We left them in circles," she mouthed once, and laughed, and the laugh sounded like wind through bone. When you collect evidence the way I had, your sense of distance changes. Files stop being data and start being neighbors. They intrude into your life. The cloud no longer seems remote. It leaks into your living room. My phone buzzed with a new message, an image time-stamped at 2:03 a.m. It was of my kitchen table, and on the chair at the head of the table, someone had placed a small spiral of twigs and dried leaves. The photograph was taken from the angle of my doorway. I live alone. I woke that night to the sound of the porch light clicking on. I held my breath, counting in the dark, telling myself it was a faulty switch or a bird striking the motion sensor. The light stayed on, painting the hole a pale, watchful yellow. I told myself to call the police. I did not. Instead, I wrapped a jacket around my shoulders and stepped outside. The spiral of twigs was gone, but the gravel had been pressed into a ring. There are decisions you make in a life like this that later appear in memory as a series of small omissions. I did not lift the camera to photograph the ring that night. I did not shout into the dark. I went back inside and left the porch light lit. In the morning, the cloud folder contained one more file. It was a photo of me sitting in a chair at the kitchen table, eyes closed, head tipped back as if listening. I had not taken that picture. The timestamp read 3:12 a.m. The metadata said the camera used had been an older model, one I do not own. When Darren came by that afternoon, he said nothing for a long time, and then, "This one is different," he said. He loaded the file slowly and turned the spectrogram up. The image beneath the pixels sang, and on the screen the rings formed once more. At the center of the rings, faint but unmistakable, a dot pulsed like a heartbeat. "That's you," Darren said finally. "But not you now, a projection. Like the files are making a version of your life and placing it at the center." I wanted to argue. Instead, I sat and watched the screen and felt the room tilt. Around us, light from the window drew a pale circle on the floor. Outside, a truck drove by and its tires hissed in a circle on wet pavement. There is a logic to the way these things escalate. A photo appears where it should not. A sound is found under hiss. A sentence in a notebook that wasn't there yesterday. You test the rubble of coincidence until the pattern coalesces into a thing you can name. Pattern, as Ruth said, lives longer than memory. What scared me that night was the sense that the circle wanted not simply to be noticed, but to be completed. The files had been dropping a breadcrumb loop for months, 9 accounts, then more, as if something wanted the ring traced outward until the center matched the outside and something could be counted or gathered or closed. I have thought about the ethics of cataloging this. I have thought of leaving the files alone and letting whatever agency is folded into the county's footnotes continue its obscure work. I have also thought, with a cold clarity, about what happens if you stop looking. Some of the people whose lives were changed by these things, the missing teen, the man in a uniform, never left a note explaining their own absence. People who vanish have no prosecutors holding depositions. The pattern, in those cases, becomes the only witness. I am writing this in the half-light because I want a record that is not only spectral analysis and whispered testimonies, because I want a reader, if there is one, to understand where this thread could lead. The ring shapes in pixels and maps and stones are not random. They are an architecture. Whether it is an architecture of human grief and memory, people building circles to hold something too big for them, or something older that uses human geometry as scaffolding, I cannot say. Tonight, the mail. "Stay in circles and you'll find the seam. The sender did not sign it."
My phone buzzed. It was an email with an attachment named last.wave. I played it. On the file, beneath static, a voice said 2 words. It was not recorded over a campfire or in the woods. It was close, in a room that had the reverberance of a small hollow. The voice was neither male nor female. It was many people speaking in such close harmonies that the words blurred. The 2 words were clear enough. Come home. When the audio finished, I realized with a small, sharp shock that the porch light had clicked on again. Outside, something walked in a slow ring around the house and paused to scratch at the window pane in a soft, absent-minded way, like someone tracing the rim of a glass. I am going back to the clearing tomorrow with a different plan. I will bring tools and light and people who know how to measure and mark and dig. I will bring Ruth and Darren and Maya. I will make a map that does more than string plots and pins. I will try to open the center and see what is at its root. Still, there is a part of me that thinks the center might be better left closed. There is a part of me that wants to fold the files into a box, label it "Do Not Open," and shove it under the floorboards. Most nights, the louder part of me, the part that has been following lines on a map, will not let me stop. If you have been following these accounts, if any of this echoes something you have seen in the dark, please take care. Circles can be comforting. They can also be cages. I will be careful. But I am going because the circle has already touched my life, and because the ring that holds these files tightens if left alone. At 2 in the morning, after I wrote the last paragraph and before I could format the files for the trip, I opened my cloud folder one more time. There was a new image. It was from a camera I had never seen. The view showed a clearing from above, the pattern of trees making a natural amphitheater. At the center, impossibly, a figure stood with arms outstretched. The figure's shadow cast a perfect circle around it. I do not know whether whoever or whatever made that image stood in the clearing when the shutter clicked, or whether the file is the work of some technician stitching moments together. But the timestamp read, "Tomorrow at sunrise." I turned off the monitor and went to bed. At 5:48 a.m., the phone alarm I had not set buzzed. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth and a sense of being observed. Somewhere outside, a faint scratching, patient and circular, kept time against the dark. I am packing my camera and my boots now. We leave before first light.